Hey everyone, so the Oscars are coming up and I want to try something new. Obviously I will be reviewing all the films nominated for Oscars in this coming Academy Awards, but I also thought since I'm only starting this now, why don't I work backwards each year? So next year I'll be covering the 98th Academy Awards and the 95th. And then also I'm going to be going forward from the first Academy Awards each year. So this year I'll be covering 97, 96 and 1. And I thought might as well start with the 96th. A few other preemptive things. Firstly, in case you're new, I rate films out of 10 and then qualify that rating with a high, middling or low. Also, I'm one of those people who uses ratings as they should be, where a middling 5 is average. So if I seem to like a movie and then give it a high 5, then I hope that makes sense to you. I like it, so I'm giving it a positive rating. I just don't like it as much as other films. Also, you'll notice this is 2 parts. My plan is to do this and the upcoming Oscars in 2 parts, but the first one in just 1 part as fewer films were nominated back then. Speaking of nominations, I won't be reviewing any shorts or documentaries. I just think talking about those films would be so different from talking about fictional feature-length films. I'm also not going to pay any attention to what category a film was nominated for. If it was nominated for something, that's good enough for me. So I may be talking about a film that was nominated for lots of really big important categories like Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, and then talk about some terrible film that was just nominated for Best Visual Effects. I personally do think the existence of these nominees kind of undermines the point of the Oscars, because people will make fun of bad movies being nominated, but that's what you just have to accept. If we're going to award categories that don't necessarily speak to the overall quality of the film, then films that are overall bad might be nominated, just how it is. And I'm going to embrace that by reviewing all these films for whatever reason they're nominated. The only final exception is I'm not going to be reviewing some big franchise movies, because I'll almost certainly talk about those in different contexts. So for example, I'm not reviewing Transformers Rise of Beasts, even though that was nominated for Best Visual Effects, because I know that at some point I'm going to review the entire Transformers franchise. So that's all the preamble out the way, and I hope you enjoy my reviews. Oh wait, one more thing. These are in kind of a random order, just in case you're confused why it seems random, it's because it is. So, first of all, I watched Anatomy of a Fool, and let me start off by saying that the woman is absolutely innocent and the husband 100% unalived himself. I don't know if there's supposed to be any ambiguity here, like is anyone praising this because they left things ambiguous? In my view, by the time you get to the argument he has with his wife, it's so obvious this guy oofed himself. He's just so self-pitying and has such a defeatist attitude towards all the problems in his life, many of which do appear to be self-inflicted. Like, one thing that stands out is the husband claiming that he always does things her way because they speak her language. But she's German. They aren't speaking her native language. Also, they're living in France. He's French. It's just so obvious all his grievances are completely at odds with reality, and that kind of irrationality doesn't exactly leave much doubt as to why he ended up falling from a 3rd-story window. But by the end, this film doesn't even seem to be trying to be open-ended. Like, spoiler alert, but the kid is like, yeah, he basically told me he was planning to unalive himself, and the prosecution is just left going, well, maybe the jury should just ignore that he said that. I'd say the real nuance in the conclusion basically surrounds how does his wife move forward from here. There are different levels at play, but I imagine a big one is that because she basically establishes what her husband actually did over the course of being exonerated of a murder charge, there must be some mixed feelings that come with that. Yippee! I'm not going to prison for murder. My husband just committed suicide. Wait, oh no, that's really messed up actually. That's how I partially interpret her measured sense of relief at the end of the film. That, and just in general, it must be a really difficult thing to go through. The film does a really good job capturing the emotional weight of the whole situation. Obviously the acting is good from everyone involved. Beyond the emotion, there's also a basic level of intrigue from just seeing this courtroom drama play out. In a world of TikTok and YouTube shorts and everyone's ever-shortening attention spans, it's significant that I was able to watch a 2.5-hour courtroom drama and feel engrossed the whole time. Like, my attention span isn't the worst ever, but I can relate to the general tendency of people to get bored by really long films, and I'd imagine most people wouldn't be bored by this one. The film also touches on themes of perception versus reality in legal proceedings. I don't think it says anything particularly novel or in-depth, but at least it's there. I guess the only thing I'll say as an aside is that I find the sound design in this film kind of confusing. There's a big focus in the middle of the film about people supposedly being able to have conversations while 50 Cent is being blasted out out really loud from the above room. I'm not going to pretend I watched this with a state-of-the-art sound system, but for me, the way the sound of the music came across was as if it was near deafening volume, like the same volume music is played at in a nightclub. So every time the film gives any time to investigating whether conversations could have been heard while this music was playing, I just find it really weird. Like, clearly it couldn't have been heard by someone a significant distance away. The volume at which it sounds like the music is being played has me feeling like I wouldn't even be able to hear a conversation happening in the same room as me. So honestly, they could have just cut this whole audio aspect of the investigation and made this film a slightly more reasonable length for a drama, because genuinely the music is literally this productive to be able to hear. We literally see the woman react to her son's cries for help from outside while this music is playing, and I don't even believe that. The film shows us it happening, and I'm still not buying it. Anyway, that aside, this film is overall pretty solid, but it's not exactly fantastic. It's just an entertaining courtroom drama with some basic emotional intrigue. So for me, that's like a middling 7 out of 10. I've seen it twice now, and I enjoyed it both times, but I have very little interest in watching it again. Fun fact, The Holdovers is actually the only movie I'm reviewing here that I watched with other people. I watched it with my family on a summer holiday in Cornwall. Technically, this movie is a Christmas movie, but for some reason, I just don't really think of it as being one. Even though the soundtrack is wall-to-wall Christmas music and they literally go to a Christmas party, it just doesn't fill me up with any Christmassy feelings. The weirdest thing about the film for me is that 40 minutes in, a third of the way through the movie, all the other kids just leave. Like, they spend a while setting up all these different kids with all their different personalities and priorities and unique situations, and you assume this is going to be about a cohort of students who form some connection and grow as characters while they're forced to board at their school over Christmas. Instead, the other kids are pretty pointless. There's one moment where a Korean kid pees his pants and the main character, Tully, helps him cover it up, which establishes that Tully is a sympathetic person. But on the other end of the spectrum, they go out of their way to show that this kid called Kuntz is an obnoxious bully, and I sort of thought he was going to have some kind of character arc, but he's just a mean guy, then he leaves. Instead, we're almost entirely focused on two main characters. The first is Mr. Hunham, played by Paul Giamatti. This character is a little bit generic in that he's your standard joyless, cranky old man, a very common trope. Thematically, he's kind of interesting in that a lot of the film is about how spoiled these kids are because they get to go to this fancy private school and have a lot of strings pulled in their favor. Hunham is actually disliked because he refuses to grant special privileges to the children of rich, powerful parents. Also, he himself was falsely accused of plagiarism at Harvard by a super rich kid whom the school believed over him. So that's a big recurring message. Society is very unfair, and there is a privileged class that has no appreciation for how good they really have it. Although this is contrasted with the reality that a lot of these children are deeply unhappy, and indeed the remaining holdover, Tully, has clearly been neglected by his own parents. I'd recommend showing this film to an 11-year-old kid who's sad they didn't get their Hogwarts letter in the post. Turns out actually going to a boarding school is incredibly depressing. There's also this whole thing with the kid's father where it's eventually revealed that actually he's a mental patient, and obviously that's pretty sad. But ultimately, the movie ends up feeling incredibly saccharine. You know, it's about these two adversaries establishing an unlikely camaraderie with each other. There are some little montages of their mutual appreciation growing as they realize maybe they have a lot more in common than they first thought. Some of this is emotionally resonant and well done. This movie is certainly competently made, but it's also a bit cliche. It's a character-driven film, but neither of the characters are super original, nor does the film appear to have anything especially important to say. If this is the first ever feel-good movie you've ever seen, you'd probably enjoy it a lot, but if you've seen quite a few movies like this, you'll realize this is nothing special. Indeed, there are plenty of movies that try to do something similar to this that I simply prefer a lot more, so I'd be unlikely to pick this movie out as really worth a watch. Still, it is entertaining, it's well acted, well shot, it has funny moments, and it does achieve a lot of what it sets out to achieve emotionally. But there's a ceiling for how good a movie can be when it's just a played out story about an odd couple who ultimately become friends. Are we going to pretend there aren't a million movies like that already? So overall for me, this is a high 6. It's good, but it's not in any real sense special. Worth a watch, definitely a fine movie to watch with a family because it's likely very crowd pleasing, but not fantastic. My understanding is that everyone's supposed to hate the movie Maestro because it's a Bradley Cooper vanity project. He was the writer, director, producer, and lead actor, so to any extent this movie comes across as pompous, unduly grandiose, and as they say, Oscar bait, it reflects poorly on Bradley Cooper because it makes it seem like he just wanted to win a load of awards. And I certainly can understand that position. This movie is black and white in the opening third to correspond to the time period where media tended to be in black and white, and all of it is in a non-standard aspect ratio. These are the kind of artistic decisions that in a really good film can be appreciated, but in a film that feels generally quite cynical, it comes across like these decisions were simply made because that's what artistic films do, and that wins awards. Having said that, to give credit where it's due, Bradley Cooper is, in my estimation, a good actor here. Leonard Bernstein feels like a totally different person, and I was at least engrossed in the notion I was watching a real human being. Unfortunately, the movie itself just feels quite hollow. I struggle to identify the real point of it. There are a few moments where Bernstein reflects on his art, the difference in prestige between writing serious classical pieces as opposed to for musicals, and the difference between the performance of being a conductor and the deep solitary intimacy of being a composer. But I couldn't really say this film offers any interesting commentary on Bernstein's art. If this film's about anything, it's about the fact that Bernstein was a married man with a family who had many gay affairs throughout his life, and obviously there's some intrigue there's some tension and struggle, but it still feels empty, partially because the idea of a barely closeted gay man isn't something new for a film to explore, so if it fails to explore that idea in an interesting way, then what's the point? The dialogue doesn't help. In keeping with the broad, pretentious presentation of the film, there are a few conversations where characters just give full-on thesis statements on their own inner turmoil, or else conspicuously psychoanalyze each other. Real people don't talk like that, and it seems to me more like they're only making these observations to give the impression the film is in some deeper sense about these character conflicts. Like, at several points characters mention the idea of honesty and authenticity, and with what's happening in the film, it certainly could have explored those ideas, but it doesn't really. At one point, his wife tells him, "There's no hate in your heart," as if it's a resolution to something, but he never seemed especially hateful to me. Anyway, his wife also gets cancer. This kind of just feels like a side quest. She gets diagnosed, then the film becomes very much about that, and then she dies, and Leonard just goes back to being gay. Overall, I think the cynical reading of this film is pretty accurate. It doesn't actually want to say something deep and meaningful, it just wants to appear as if it's deep and meaningful, so people will give kudos to Bradley Cooper. In the end, it didn't win any of the Oscars it was nominated for, so I guess this film didn't achieve the one thing it was supposed to achieve, which makes it a bit of a failure. Still, I don't know if I hate this film the way lots of people seem to, like as if it's a personal insult to me that Bradley Cooper felt like making an Oscar bait movie to try to win some awards. That doesn't bother me, it's a free country. Still, I don't feel like I get anything out of this film. None of it resonates with me emotionally, probably because there is an aura of insincerity that hangs over the whole thing. As far as a rating goes, probably a high 5, slightly better than average because there is still talent to be appreciated. That's undeniable. It's just lacking that real sense of vision and purpose that I prefer to see in a film that is supposed to be a deep exploration of someone's life. I guess with Past Lives, a good way to talk about it would be the title. It's a reference to the Buddhist idea of inyan, that if two people have a connection in their current lives, it must mean that they had some connection in a previous life. Obviously, with this comes a sense of fatalism regarding relationships. Rather than this film being about what could have been, it seems more content to just recognize things are what they are. And I do enjoy that realistic aspect of the film. There's even a bit where Nora's husband contrasts how bland the actual relationship she has ended up in with the relationship she would have had if she stayed in Korea. I suppose I should briefly summarize the plot before I go on. A girl has a boyfriend in Korea, she leaves, and 12 years later they start a long-distance relationship between Seoul and New York, but it isn't sustainable, and 12 years later, still, they haven't spoken for 12 years, she's married, but he comes to see her to reconnect. In reality, the aforementioned realism means there's never any genuine sense that the two might actually end up rekindling their romance. There's just a forlorn, mutual recognition of what could have otherwise been between the two. Speaking of realism, it's quite nice to see a romance that focuses on video calling, since that is, in reality, how a lot of contemporary relationships actually do develop. I don't know how much the film can be said to thematically expand upon the idea of inyan. The main function of it, as already said, is to introduce an idea that whatever is was supposed to happen, that she and her husband have inyan from past lives, while she and this other guy don't. The most interesting twist is right at the end, when the Korean guy asks, what if this life is the past life that will serve as a referent to a future Inyan. Not only is that intrinsically interesting in the way considering time in a non-linear manner always is, but it also does maybe push back against the erstwhile fatalism of the film. Sure, maybe this meeting is in part determined by their Inyan, their past lives, but perhaps they also have the power in this life to determine their future encounters. There's also an apparent double meaning to this idea of past lives. The film starts off with some strangers observing the main characters in a bar. They speculate on what their actual relationship is to each other, their past lives, and then obviously the film then proceeds to actually show a lot of their past lives up until that point and give us that context. So even if we don't have literal spiritual past lives, we still do have past lives. Nora literally tells her Korean friend, "The girl you knew when I was younger was real, but she doesn't exist anymore. She is literally a past life." And the flip side is that to her current husband, her past life is inaccessible. He tells her that she talks in her sleep in Korean, and how he feels like he can't fully connect to that Korean side of her personality because he was born and raised in America. So yeah, the film has a lot to say thematically. I should acknowledge the other basic things. It's well shot, well edited, well acted. Some of the dialogue I thought was a little unnatural, but that was only the Korean portions, and maybe they just speak in a different way. I did find the pacing a little weird, like it's hard to know where you are in the film, and the way it blasts through the first 24 years and then lingers on just a few days in the second half does feel a little unbalanced, but not in a way that I didn't ultimately enjoy. I just can't pretend I didn't at one point check the runtime and think, oh really? We're only halfway through? But this film is really emotionally powerful. It's one of those films that left me with a sort of pleasant aching immediately after watching it. You know, when you've experienced some intense emotions and then the film just leaves you with them to sit and meditate on? Having said that, there are definitely films that have stayed with me emotionally more than this. I should also say, in anticipation of not rating this film insanely high, that I didn't connect with the characters that much on an emotional level. I recognize the emotions being communicated, but I didn't feel like I was basically in their shoes. So overall for me, this is a low 8. I was thinking high 7 this whole time until I really reflected on the thematic substance of the film and realized it does have a lot going on, which I have to give some serious credit. Mai Decembre is about an actor who, for an upcoming movie role, is investigating the life of a woman who had an affair with a 7th grader, a 12 to 13-year-old for non-Americans. Unsurprisingly, this movie has a generic creepy vibe throughout, complemented by the foreboding soundtrack. Also, it's very uncomfortable watching this family be observed and all their awkward tension made obvious to this outsider. The premise of the movie is great for a character study. Portman's character is literally studying the character of Gracie. And it needs to be said, Gracie is certifiably insane. Throughout the movie, you have so many moments of her either blowing minor things out of proportion while having no appreciation for the significance of other things, like that having sex with a 12-year-old is wrong. Characters use the word naive to describe her a lot. And that kind of makes sense. Her now adult partner, Joe, is very mature for his age, while Gracie comes across as incredibly immature. In reality, of course, their marriage is fraught with issues. Gracie is very controlling and overly critical of Joe, while Joe is having an emotional affair with an unseen woman on the phone, and has a physical affair with Natalie Portman. Gracie's also a horrible mother. She makes those passive-aggressive comments about weight that stereotypical judgmental mothers like to make, and her daughters call her out for this directly. I'll say now that while I think Gracie is very strongly characterized, I'll be a bit critical and say it's all done in a pretty obvious way. It's not bad at all, but the comments about her daughter's weight aren't exactly subtle, and I describe them as stereotypical because they are a pretty played out way that you can show a mother is overly critical. Things do get a bit more complicated with the children from her previous marriage, of whom we're only really introduced to her son Georgie. He claims that they never speak to each other and also that she was abused in the past, but Gracie says that she speaks to Georgie every day. This is actually the final time we see her, and it's supposed to be a bit of a twist, because it's the only moment where two characters say things that directly contradict each other. I think the way she almost gleefully contradicts our prior understanding of her is supposed to communicate that she's more in the know than we'd previously been left to believe. Basically, she's a lot more consciously manipulative. I don't love that as a revelation. I prefer the idea that she's as much a victim of her own toxic controlling mentality as anyone else, such that she doesn't even realize what she's doing. Especially since there are some aspects of her life that are just so pathetic they're sad, like how she presents herself as reasonably popular because she has a few close friends, but in reality almost the entire town hates her. Obviously this movie has themes of maturity and abuse, and definitely perception versus reality, considering it's literally about an actor researching for a movie role. Gracie wants to present a certain image of what their family's like, while we have no idea how the movie will present things. Will it be trashy and almost fetishistic, or very dark and serious, or something else entirely? The stated reason Joe and Gracie go along with it is as an opportunity to tell their side of the story, but clearly there's no assurance the movie will be faithful to that. The affair happened in a pet shop, which I think is obviously supposed to have some significance, like that Gracie is a predator or something and Joe is her pet, but the real symbolic animal motif is Joe's habit of collecting butterflies. We see him doing this throughout the film. Gracie is very critical of it, obviously, and the woman with whom he's having an emotional affair is a fellow butterfly enthusiast. He does it because the butterfly population is threatened, so people helping to raise them can serve to alleviate that. He captures caterpillars and waits for them to mature, then releases them. The contrast with his own life is pretty stark. He didn't get to reach maturity properly, and it's not clear if he'll ever be free. I should say that Charles Melton, who plays Joe, gives a fantastic performance, and the moments with him are a highlight. Although maybe the reason I don't like the scenes with Gracie is because Julianne Moore does such a good job playing an insufferable crazy lady, which also suggests acting talent. Anyway, so the main positives are the strength of the premise and the performance. The characterization is strong, but I think sometimes the way they communicate that characterization is more obvious than subtle. Still, that's a pretty minor criticism, but I didn't feel super engaged with the film emotionally, and that might be why. Overall though, the film is a deep exploration of a very messed up dynamic and some really interesting characters, so I'd happily give it a high 7. Very good, but I can't rate it higher than some other movies that I connected with a lot more on an emotional level. So this was my third year in a row where I've watched the movie Barbie, and I can confirm it holds up reasonably well. The first massive point in this film's favour is simply the number of novel environments and the wacky premise that inherently makes this film visually interesting. Being different is a huge point that can work to any film's favour. Also making this film very watchable is the simple fact that for the vast majority of it I had a big old goofy smile on my face. It definitely has some solid jokes, but aside from that, even when it's not being funny, it's at least being fun. The main form of comedy I really love is its commitment to absurdism. Indeed, if you don't find silly things happening intrinsically funny, you probably wouldn't like this movie. If you're a generally serious, miserable person, you'd hate it. But I love it, especially all the jokes they make about the universe of Barbie, like that people just float because Barbies would typically be moved by just being picked up and moved around. That's the kind of stuff I always look for in an inanimate object is actually alive in its own universe premise. But the biggest benefit of the absurdist comedy is that it's much easier for such a film to have themes without them feeling overbearing. There are fantastic dramas with deep themes to them, obviously, but if you had a similar film to this with a big focus on gender politics, it would probably be really cringe if it tried to play it totally seriously. However, with this movie, it's fine if some of the commentary is a bit on the nose and everyone behaves in an exaggerated way, because that's the point. Like, yeah, it's not as if any woman walking down a street is going to have literally every single guy making overtly sexual comments. That's obviously exaggerated and ridiculous, but for this movie, it's fine if everything is exaggerated and ridiculous. I really can't review this film properly without talking about its theming, which in practice means talking about feminism. As I see it, this film really has two key focuses: 1990s power feminism and patriarchy in general. So the power feminism point is pretty simple. The idea is introduced that Barbie is actually super empowering because Barbie can still be a kick-ass girl boss while also achieving all sorts of incredible things. And this is contrasted with the actual reality where overtly feminine women tend to be less successful, and actually the idea of Barbie as the perfect woman has really just held women back. The film doesn't really make an actual criticism of this type of feminism or explore why it's not really achieved any results. No systemic analysis here or anything like that, which is what I expect from my Barbie movies. The patriarchy thing in general is a lot more silly. Again, I don't know if the film really says anything substantive about patriarchy for most of it. The closest it comes would be the fact that everyone higher up at Mattel is a man, and we get one of my favourite lines: "I'm a man with no power, does that make me a woman?" The function of the plot point where Ken returns to Barbie Land is clearly supposed to just be comedic. Barbie Land has no immunity to patriarchy, so this moron is able to clumsily implement it despite not really knowing what it is. Hilarious. Unfortunately, there is one moment where the film gets a bit too sincere in a way that comes across as cringy. You know the scene I'm talking about, where this woman goes on an elaborate rant about what it's like to live as a woman in current year. Previously, I've always said I like this scene because in the cinema after she finished, several people in the audience started cheering, which was hilarious. But the further removed I get from that experience, the more this scene serves to knock the film down. Also, not to debunk this woman epic Ben Shapiro style, but her main criticism is that she's expected to be loads of contradictory things. Isn't that just because society isn't a monolith? Like, everyone's expected to be contradictory things because different people expect different contradictory things of us. I guess since I just basically said, well, everyone has these problems, I should touch on Ken's situation. I don't entirely know what to make of the fact that the Barbie society is sort of an oppressive society for men. Like, men have less representation in this society than women have in the real world. I'm not upset by that, but I'm sort of just wondering how we're supposed to understand it. Ken's ultimate conclusion is that he needs to learn to not define himself entirely by his relationship to Barbie, which I don't think that's supposed to be any sort of social commentary because men generally don't define themselves with reference to women. While I'm on the subject, I'll say that Ken is arguably the best and funniest part of this movie, which I realize is funny on a meta level, that a man kind of steals the show in a movie made for and about women, whatever. So yeah, in conclusion, I don't think this movie serves well as a deep exploration of feminism, but I also largely don't have a problem with the way it touches on these issues, except for one scene. To circle back to where I began, this movie's main strength is how funny and creative it is. Insofar as it engages with gender relations, it's more for the purpose of observational comedy rather than some deeper analysis, and that's fine. Although I do imagine someone could do a very deep dive into the themes of Barbie if they weren't me, trying to keep my review relatively short, even though I think at this point it's the longest review of this whole video, and I'm leaving some notes on the cutting room floor. Middling 7 out of 10. I have a confession, I watched The Boy and the Heron over Christmas, but because I hadn't yet psyched myself up for this project, I didn't just write the script then. So now it's January 12th, 3 weeks after I watched this film, and I'm watching it again just to review it, which is pretty stupid. Oh, also, I have another confession. I don't really like Miyazaki movies. I mean, I don't dislike them, I've never given them a negative score, but none of them really leave an impression with me. And to illustrate that point, I'm writing this intro before rewatching the film, and even though I only saw the film 3 weeks ago, I can hardly remember anything from it. Something to do with a tower, and then maybe the tower is a portal to a spirit world and there's a guy wearing a heron costume. I can't really remember the main objective. I think the guy has to rescue his stepmom. I didn't get any impression of themes or anything like that. I couldn't tell you on a deeper level what the movie was about. However, I've also never rewatched a Miyazaki movie before. Every movie I've seen from him, I've only seen once, so let's see if giving this film another watch changes my assessment. Right, let me start with some compliments. First of all, I do like how the film looks. The vibrant green is really pretty. My issue is, well, don't all Miyazaki movies kind of look the same? And also, are they really that different from other Japanimation? The only thing that really stands out about his animation to me is that he makes all the old ladies look like hobbits from the Rankin Bass films. Those films weren't praised for their animation. In a world where one of the awesome things about animation is how wild and varied it can be, I'm not a huge fan of the fact that Miyazaki's films mostly all have the same animation style. Also, I really like herons. They just have this majestic beauty that I remember before my first watch had me excited at what the film was going to be about. But then the heron just is a guy wearing a heron costume who guides him through this spiritual world. The spiritual world is fine. I don't really know what it's supposed to be symbolizing. I don't really know if there's any interesting lore to it. I guess it's just an absurdist nonsense world, which I kind of like. I like Alice in Wonderland, but Alice in Wonderland is really funny and plays into it being nonsense in an entertaining way. Here, sure, there's like pelicans that eat baby souls, and there's a legion of parakeets that eat people, but anyone can just invent nonsense. I just don't know what part of the storytelling was supposed to impress me here. Was there something deeper going on that I'm missing? Are there aspects of the spiritual world that signify aspects of the real world? This movie takes place during World War II, but I couldn't identify a single aspect of the spiritual world that functioned as a commentary on that. I couldn't tell you why this story was set during World War II at all. Side note about that, it's implied his mother died in a firebombing, quote, 3 years into the war, but that would be 1940. So who exactly was bombing them? Or do the Japanese consider their war against the Chinese and their war against the US to be two separate wars? So that means they were the baddies in two separate wars at the same time? I also didn't really care emotionally about any of the relationships. Like, I guess in some way his dynamic change of his stepmom, but not discernibly to me. I realize I'm English and the film is in Japanese. Maybe there's some cultural thing I'm missing here. Also, maybe there is some deeper meaning to this stuff that I could look up and gain some appreciation of it if I understood Japan, but frankly, I simply don't think so. And if whatever merit there is to this movie is so inaccessible I'd need to do research in order to appreciate it, I think it's failed as a movie. I mean, I can appreciate the animation, that is good, but there are like 24 other Miyazaki movies before this that have this exact same style of animation. So at some point that has to stop counting massively in this film's favour. Overall, for me it's a low 4. I mean, I can't go any higher than that, and arguably I should go lower. I found this film super boring and substanceless. It's the only film so far I struggled to actually make it all the way through without pausing and just desperately wanting to do something else. Next, I watched Elemental, and I have a suggestion for how this movie could have been improved. Whenever Claude's not on screen, all the other characters should be asking, "Where's Claude?" In all seriousness though, the positives of this movie are that the animation is reasonably interesting, not super innovative since I'm sure CG waters look good for a while, but it's a little different. Also, the premise is, I assume, original, like a city where different people are different elements, although it's sort of just original in the sense of, well, we haven't done this yet. Like, we've had, what if there was a society of emotions? What about a society of animals? What about a society of emojis? Still, at least there's some thought put into how this society would function, and there's a lot of creativity with the way that various elements use their abilities. Although the one weird aspect of the lore here is that I guess inter-elemental relationships just never happen in this world, because the premise is that this fire girl falls in love with a water boy, and they're not even sure if they'll be able to touch each other, so these are the first two people from different elements to ever even try touching. The romance aspect is pretty cute. I like the characterization for the boyfriend. It's sort of cute seeing a guy who's really emotional. The characterization corresponds to what elements they are. This guy is really in touch with his emotions and he's water, like he can go with the flow. And she's fire and she has a fiery temper. Oh, and also the water guy is called Wade, and the fire girl is called Ember. Ember's temper does make her kind of annoying at times in that way where it's annoying if characters behave totally irrationally. Like, her father's independent business is being shut down, so she goes to City Hall to plead her case, but for some reason when Wade starts explaining the situation and saying really nothing wrong, she gets incredibly mad and just sets everything on fire, thus potentially directly causing her dad's business to get shut down. Speaking of contrived and stupid conflict, this movie has a very cliche Romeo and Juliet aspect to it, where they can't just be together because they're from two separate worlds. Not really original. Still, I was invested in actually seeing their romance work out, so it didn't completely fall flat. The other cliche is there's a whole thing about her dad wanting her to carry on the family business, but she doesn't really want to. That's an incredibly common trope for family-oriented narratives, especially since they're supposed to be representative of immigrant populations, where obviously carrying on your parents' traditions is often considered more important. There are a few fish out of water moments, or fire in water moments, I guess, but it doesn't veer into heavy-handed racism parallels, which is nice. The other main plot is about a dam potentially bursting and destroying the fire district. I wasn't that invested in this because, well, it's just not a credible threat, nor is it very interesting as a threat. It's not exactly exciting just maintaining a dam. The film also isn't that funny. I don't think I laughed once, which sucks because sometimes these Disney and Pixar animations can actually get some laughs out of me. This one didn't. Oh, except for Claude, who made me laugh every time he was on screen. Anyway, I'll still give this a high 5 out of 10. It's very cliche, which isn't great, but the novel animation and the competently expressed emotional connection between the two main characters puts this just above average. So Nimona is, on balance, a good movie, but I'm going to start off complaining for a bit because there is one big negative. This film is very cliche. It's about a traditional kingdom with traditional values, but there's a monster that threatens this kingdom. However, in reality, this monster is a very sympathetic character, a girl called Nimona, and maybe the real monster is society's intolerance. On that note, the main character of this movie, Ballister, is in an interracial gay relationship. The people in this society are completely okay with that, but they hate monsters. This feels like a very common trope, and the film doesn't really do that much with it. Almost every single major plot beat with Nimona is defined by her being perceived as a monster, when in reality she's not one. I'd be surprised if anyone's listening right now thinking, wow, actually that sounds like a groundbreaking novel premise. What's slightly more interesting about this film is that it's set in a medieval society that has a lot of modern elements to it, so people will literally watch medieval jousting tournaments on the TV, the knights use crossbows with laser sights. I mean, a medieval world that's kind of futuristic is basically what Shrek did, but this plays the premise a lot more seriously. The main plot is that a guy from non-noble birth is about to be officially knighted, but he's framed to make it appear like he killed the queen. Turns out there's a woman with more traditional values who thinks this would destroy their society, so she frames him. Nimona, who is understood to be a villain, then tries to team up with this guy because she wants a supervillain to be a sidekick for. That specific aspect is a good premise, an aspiring villain sidekick tagging on with someone under the impression they're a villain, only to realize they're not. But obviously in reality, turns out neither of them are evil. By the way, the sidekick is played by Chloe Grace Moretz, and they have a moment where she beats people up and it plays the same song as when she does that in Kick-Ass. Not very original. They trick the person who framed Ballister into confessing with some shapeshifter shenanigans. Have I even mentioned yet that Nimona is a shapeshifter? She is. But then this kind of backfires on them because obviously then the villain is just like, well, that was actually the shapeshifter pretending to be me. Then there's a falling out where Ballister maybe a bit unrealistically gets suspicious of Nimona even though she's been helping him the whole time. The plot is actually pretty thin. The movie wraps up after only an hour and 20 minutes, even though there's a whole thing about the city being surrounded by a wall, and Nimona's even explicitly like, maybe there's nothing behind the wall and this society is just making stuff up to keep people scared, and then they never even end up confirming what's on the other side of the wall. You never see it. Anyway, I should mention the animation. It's kind of visually interesting, but it also reminded me of a few animations I've seen on YouTube before, which even though in the context of YouTube I'd say those animations look really good, that association made it feel kind of cheap. The animation is kind of down the middle for me. I wasn't wowed by it, but I also thought it was kind of interesting. Everything else is very neatly divided into positives and negatives though. The medieval futurism aesthetic is good, the cliche who's the real monster narrative isn't. Overall the film is fine, but I couldn't say it does anything so special or unique that it's particularly worth giving a watch, so it's a low 6 out of 10 from me. So, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is kind of a lot. Just like the last film, the animation is really unique. Can't praise that as much though because obviously it's been done before in the previous film. While I like the animation, I think how vibrant it is can feel kind of hectic at times, especially when combined with all the action in this film. Less than 20 minutes in and I was already ready for it to be over, so imagine my shock when I discovered we weren't even at the opening credits yet. Fortunately, after a while, I was able to get used to just how frenetic it was and ultimately start to appreciate what the film had to offer. In fact, I might as well jump right to the end and say I was really into the final twist. Obviously I haven't been that careful around spoilers in any of these reviews, but since I just said the words final twist, I'll say if you haven't seen this film, you should probably skip using the chapters. But basically, this film reminds us that Miles Morales in this film was bitten by a spider from another dimension. So when he later on uses a machine to return back to his dimension, it reads the spider DNA instead and sends him back to another one. And the way they reveal this just works really well because obviously his parents don't know about him being Spider-Man anyway, so when they react a bit confused, it makes sense. So it isn't until they're full on like, wait, who the hell even is Spider-Man, that he suddenly realizes he's in a completely different universe. And then he gets captured by a villain and you're like, oh no, this guy's the big bad villain. But it turns out the big bad villain is Miles Morales from this dimension. I don't know if I explained that well, so maybe all I've done there is manage to spoil the movie without even making it fully clear what I'm talking about. Good job, me. And then even though I've seen this film before, I still forgot that it basically ends mid-climax with a whole load of stuff still in play and a cliffhanger for the next part. To be fair, the character of Spot wasn't really explored that much in this film at all. Like obviously he has his moments, but I assume he'll have more of a role in the next part. The big focus for this film is that apparently there are such things as canon events in Spider-Man, events that need to happen or else the universe gets destroyed. They don't really explain this and how it works, like on a meta level, does the multiverse actually exist in in a comic strip, and that's what they mean by canon events, that would make sense, but I don't think they've ever been explicit about that. You know, why does the structure of the universe itself seem to care what happens to this one kid? Honestly, this plot point kind of makes Miles seem like a jerk. All these smart other Spider-Men seem to agree that messing around with the dimensions is a dangerous thing to do, and they're all willing to make sacrifices accordingly, but Miles is just like, nah, I don't feel like letting these things happen to me, so I guess I'll just destroy an entire dimension and kill billions of people. Speaking of Miles being a jerk, if I were his parents, I'd come down so hard on him. He misses way too many family occasions and is not taking some really important things in life seriously. Honestly, when I saw him talking to Gwen, I'd be like, oh good, at least he's focusing on something normal and has got himself a hot girlfriend. In reality, the Gwen-Miles romance thing is a little underdeveloped. Like, I really do get much stronger friend vibes from them than romance vibes. Something else I really need to say about this film is, why is it that the only difference between the Spider-Men is their race and nationality? Like, in the first film, all the different types of Spider-Man were really weird and wacky. Here, there are a few weird ones, like I enjoyed Lego Spider-Man, and obviously it's cool seeing live-action characters making cameos, but these were just cameos, and most of the variety here is like, there's a woman Spider-Man, an Indian Spider-Man, a Hispanic Spider-Man, a black British Spider-Man. When they arrive at the big interdimensional Spider-Man HQ, the first thing they see is a Muslim Spider-Woman. So I guess this film is worse than the first one, even though I liked the ending and am potentially excited about the next part. There isn't that much of this I like. The balancing of real life and being Spider-Man is kind of present, especially in his relationship with his parents, but overall I still prefer the Raimi films because they lean into that a lot more. So for me, this is a high 6. I realize now as I conclude on the best animated nominees that even though I've seen all of them before, I could hardly remember any details from them. Robot Dreams is the one exception to this rule. I actually remember the broad details of the movie very well, despite seeing it just as long ago, if not longer ago, than many of these other movies. And I guess what I'm really saying there is that visceral, emotional movies stick with you more than movies that are much more focused on plot. I don't know if I'll hear September by Earth, Wind and Fire the same ever again. I cried at the end of this film. I guess I should say that now. It's such a wonderfully bittersweet ending, and it's just so much to process. The first time I watched it, I didn't cry, but I did feel very emotional. However, the second time, I knew where the film was going, and that anticipation made it far more intensely emotional. My assessment of the film is largely based on its emotional power. I wouldn't say it has themes beyond the obvious ones of friendship, loss, basically just themes that parallel the emotional content. The animation is very basic, but I don't think that's objectively a bad thing, and on the contrary, for the innocent and earnest nature of this film, the simple animation possibly works better than any other style. But really, I should just talk about the emotional ups and downs of this film. The beginning portrayal of this guy's loneliness is sad enough, but things really kick up a notch once he and the robot start becoming friends. The pure joy on the robot's face just hanging out with his best buddy is intoxicating. He's like a dog. In just a few minutes, they're able to make these guys seem like such good friends. Now, if you don't know, the basic plot of this film is then that after rusting up on a beach, the robot is unable to move, and the dog has to wait until next summer to rescue him. It's sort of hard to believe he'd have to wait a whole year to be able to rescue his supposed best friend, but they do a really good job showing how much the dog cares about him. He tries really hard to get him off the beach himself, then he tries looking for someone but everyone's left, then he tries calling someone but the phone's been vandalized. Even after he leaves, he stays up all night so he can get to the beach first thing in the morning, but the beach has been shut until next summer. He applies for special permission to access the beach but is denied, and then he tries to break in, and then when next summer comes around, he shows up at the beach right away, and unfortunately by that time, the robot has been scavenged by someone else, sold to a scrapyard, and now has a new owner. Most of the plot is set during this year of them being apart. The robot has several dreams while he waits a year to be rescued. Meanwhile, the dog tries to make some new friends but struggles, which is quite sad to see. In the end, after he can't find the robot, he caves and ends up buying a new robot friend. And all this leads to the tearful conclusion. After both having new friendships, the robot catches a glimpse of his old dog friend. He imagines running down to meet him, but recognizes the awkwardness this would create in light of them both now having new pairings. The robot plays their favorite song from a distance, and they both dance to it in sync, although the dog never actually sees him. In the end, the robot decides not to try to rekindle the friendship, and they go their separate ways. Although really, if you think about it, there's no reason they couldn't have formed a friend group of 4. But we're not here to nitpick the logic from the characters that leads to this climax. We're here to cry our eyes out at this beautiful friendship coming to an end. I think I'm right, there's a famous moment where Anthony Fantano cried while listening to an album but still gave it a relatively low score. I don't think I'm at risk of repeating that mistake, as I really appreciate films that are emotional. However, I will just make one small criticism. The middle section of this film I think could get old after a few watches. The key points are the beginning, where the friendship is established, and the ending, where they both let it go. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy the titular robot dreams during the period he was on the beach, but one time I'll admit I checked how far through the film I was and had a slight sense of, oh, we're only halfway, and therefore I don't think this film is as evergreen as some other films that really get to me emotionally. Still, I'm giving this film a low 8. It's rare enough for a film to make me cry that I think if a film does that, I have to acknowledge it did something really impressive. There is a supreme irony at the center of American fiction, because it's basically about a guy who's annoyed that all black media seems to be incredibly reductive about the African American experience and largely exists to make white audiences feel some kind of intellectual and emotional catharsis about racial injustices, and isn't that exactly what this movie is? Like, this movie is definitely reductive about the African American experience. In this movie, black people are just seemingly obsessed with being black. Almost every conversation they have is about being black and the black experience, to the point that when meeting Monk's girlfriend, before wanting to know anything about her or understand who she is as a person on a deeper level, the first thing anyone says to her is, "I'm so glad you're not white." Like, by its very nature, this movie presents a world where black people's stories are only ever about them being black and tied up with race. And then obviously this movie was nominated for an Academy Award, and now here I am as a white dude talking about it, so how is this movie that different from the parody book that Monk writes? However, I'm sort of working on the assumption that's kind of the point. I mean, the movie ends in this incredibly meta way that all but confirms that it's intended to be a piece of art that embodies the very things the movie itself is trying to criticize, and on some level, that's brilliant. I mean, a big part of this story is that since Monk, who's a literary professor, writes his trashy book under a pseudonym, he ends up being called upon as an expert judge to assess the eligibility of his own book for a reward. The issue is, part of the satirical element of this film is that it has no real subtlety. And yeah, okay, that makes it obvious this is a satire, like The Onion isn't exactly subtle. It's pretty obviously satire when they're talking about media showing the diversity of the African American experience while they run a montage of black men being shot by the cops. But doesn't that kind of make some of the jokes here groaners? The one that really sticks out is when all the white judges talk over and ignore the black judges regarding Monk's book, and then they're like, "I think this book deserves to win because we need to listen to black voices." Like, the fact that joke is so on the nose and has all the subtlety of a brick to the face kind of makes it a bad joke. I'd contrast this with Barbie. Barbie also wasn't exactly subtle, but the thing is, Barbie was also really over the top and absurdist and silly, so you don't expect people to behave like normal people. This movie exists in an uncanny valley where it's sort of serious, like characters die and the interpersonal relationships are treated as if they have serious stakes. There are also some funny moments, like the sales call where Monk has to pretend to be a gangster in order to make his book seem authentic, but for me, this movie isn't consistently funny enough that I can commend it as a great satire of anything. There's too many moments where I'm just like, okay, I get the joke, you're not being subtle about it. Like, the very first scene is a white woman being offended by a black man using the N-word, and that's basically the whole movie. Also, I don't even know if I accept the premise of this film. As already said, the idea is that people only want to hear reductive stories about black experience, and apparently this means largely stories about black people being violent gangsters. But I'm not aware of a single book written about black gangsters, so I'm not entirely sure what this movie is parodying in this case, because there's barely even a reality for it to parody. My favourite moment thematically for the film is when another black author challenges Monk on whether it's even illegitimate for people to tell these cliché one-dimensional stories about black people. As she points out, there are black people who have rough experiences and end up turning to crime, and we shouldn't just deny that reality because it's inconveniently stereotypical to tell those stories? That is an interesting question. How do we balance wanting to push back against generalizations while also fully representing a common experience? The film doesn't answer that question, but sometimes I think positing interesting questions can be creditable in itself. One final positive is I like the way when he was writing a scene from the book, they showed the dialogue being acted out in front of him. It was a very well done scene, and I'm kind of disappointed they didn't do more stuff like that. Overall though, I just feel this film could have been more clever. Like, the whole meta thing is really interesting, but the evident undeniable lack of subtlety really takes away from it. If you had a very similar premise but maybe made it a little less on the nose and maybe a bit more clever and pointed with some of the criticisms being made, this could be a really great film. Oh, and before I move on to the rating, I should say I've heard some people dispute whether this film is intentionally meta. If that's not the case, this is a lot worse. My assumption is that the meta elements are intentional, and as such that's an interesting idea for a movie, but the execution just lacks a lot of subtlety, and the film is way too sincere with its tone to get away with that lack of subtlety. It's a comedy, but it's trying way too hard to be funny. So I think with those last few comments, I just convinced myself to knock this film down from a low 6 to a high 5. By the way, if this film isn't self-aware about the fact it's literally the thing it's complaining about, this would be like a middling 3. The Zone of Interest has one very simple, but also very striking premise. What if you told a story about a family and their unique family-oriented problems, but the father of the family happened to be overseeing a concentration camp? Specifically, the film is in part about the mother of this family who has gone to a great deal of effort to cultivate a lovely garden outside the camp. Obviously, the contrast is very striking. Apparently, the way they filmed this was to start by making a film about the family and scripting and shooting and sound designing with no regard at all for what was going on specifically in the camp. And then they had the sound designers make a completely separate movie about what was going on in the camp, but only do the sound design for that. So as we're watching this movie about the family, we can hear a completely separate story unfolding inside the camp. And because these two stories were constructed separately from each other, it means that the family literally doesn't react to what's going on in the camp at all. You may hear screaming or gunshots, but the family just goes about their day as if it's not happening at all. Honestly, I kind of wish they'd gone further with this. I'd be very interested in a movie where a massive crime against humanity was happening in the background, but the focus was almost entirely on stuff unrelated to that. As things stand in this film, they have all sorts of petty concerns, like it's a big disaster that Rudolph is going to be transferred to a different camp because then they'll have to lose their home, but all the people in the camp were forced out of their homes. There are also moments where the fact that Rudolph's job is really demanding and stressful is presented as a serious issue for the family, and lots of the people are very methodical about how they're going to exterminate all these people as if it's a problem at work just like any other. The ending to the film is really interesting. The way it ends in the present day, with workers setting up the Auschwitz Museum for the visitors. I think the interpretation of this is pretty obvious, that there's an inherent but inescapable contradiction between mundanity and evil, that whenever evil occurs, it will in some way fade into the background. Even at this museum that exists just to understand this tragedy, there are still people who go about their day doing mundane things, like this is their job. Even if you go to the museum, sure, you'll hopefully be respectful, but even just a stray conversation or thought towards something mundane, and you're demonstrating the point that there'll always be a disconnect between the intensity of emotion true evil warrants and our actual capacity to just go through life. Even as I watched this film, I'll confess that I paused it at one point to have a conversation with my wife about a Bible study she was attending. Obviously it's not equivalent, but there's kind of a parallel between me watching this film about a tragedy and pausing just to have a casual conversation, and the way the people in the film just went on with their lives while this was happening. On that note, I can't not mention what's happening in Gaza, people forced into an open-air prison and confined to an ever smaller portion of it, while bombs are indiscriminately fired at them and children are sniped in the head. In reviewing this movie about people going about their day like everything's fine while there's a crime against humanity going on, I can't not make it clear that there's a similar thing going on right now, and I absolutely oppose it. If you're going to say, well, that's politics, don't get political, that's happening over there, and here, I just want to do something mundane and listen to you talk about films, well, congratulations on having the exact attitude that this film is criticizing. And frankly, it's insane to me that many otherwise decent people have reviewed this film while the persecution of the Palestinians is still ongoing and haven't thought, hey, maybe I should take this moment to on the record condemn what's happening right now in Gaza. But of course, in keeping with the message of the film, I do recognize sometimes the sheer mundanity of life can make it seem impossible to meaningfully oppose evil. Obviously, in talking about this film, I have to mention what's happening, but after this, I'm going to get lunch and enjoy that and actually start watching another film immediately after this one, and there'll still be people starving to death in Gaza. And that's the point of the film. There is no adequate response to evil, and I think the film does a good job making that point. My only real criticism is I think it could have gone a little harder with the disconnect rather than making a lot of the issues the family faces directly relevant to the functioning of the camp, because the thematic and emotional power is in how they're able to detach themselves from what they're doing. Still, it's a low 9 out of 10 from me, and my only 9 out of 10 in reviewing these films so far, and yeah, Free Palestine. Next, I watched The Creator. This movie is just a very generic, competent sci-fi action movie. There's nothing about it that's incredible, but there's also nothing huge to criticize. The basic premise of the movie is almost like an inversion of Terminator. In Terminator, AI fires nukes at humanity to try to wipe them out, and the story insofar as it's set after those events is about humanity's heroic efforts to fight back against this AI and defeat it. In this movie, there's a nuclear explosion that's blamed on AI, and it is then used as a pretense to declare war on all AI and also those nations that harbour AI. Already, you're probably picking up the not-so-subtle references to the war on terror. AI are like terrorists, and the countries that harbour them are like Afghanistan. There's an equivalent to Bin Laden they're hunting called NOMINEES, and the evil imperialist human rights abusing power illegally invading them is the USA in both cases. Also, it's kind of like the Vietnam War in terms of setting, and also the way the soldiers travel from village to village, torturing and intimidating innocent farmers into giving information about these secret rebel bases. Honestly though, this movie definitely could have leaned into this parallel more and been more interesting. Like, what ulterior motives are there for this invasion of another country? Because we know that Iraq had nothing to do with stopping terrorism. Also, it's kind of disappointing this movie starts off with newsreels and press conferences to function as exposition. There's a moment where a guy just addresses the camera and is like, as you know, we're at war with the AI after they nuked Los Angeles. And it's like, can't you make the dialogue a little bit more natural? Maybe this was a studio mandate because people think audiences will refuse to watch media if they're not immediately informed about every aspect of this world, but honestly, if you cut this conference, we'd pick up most of what we need to know just from other scenes. It's just little things like that which can make a movie feel more generic and less creative because it's such a lazy way to communicate the plot. But really, most of this film is centered on the main character, Joshua, of whom this movie is a pretty substantial exploration. He starts off as an undercover agent for the US, but has developed feelings for his wife. When she is killed in a US strike along with his unborn child, he gets jaded and leaves the army. However, he's brought back in when it turns out the AI resistance is working on a superweapon, and he's convinced to join with the suggestion his wife might still be alive. He eventually discovers the secret weapon is a child capable of learning and evolving. It's kind of dumb, this is the revolutionary aspect of this child as a superweapon. Everyone's like, this child is different, she's able to learn and evolve and understand things. But isn't the capacity to learn kind of the whole point of AI? And also something that AI is capable of even right now? I guess while I'm complaining about this kid, I'll say I was thinking immediately this kid was probably his child. Turns out she basically is, so that was a predictable twist. Also, another twist is that his wife was Nimona. The weird thing about this one is that the US knew this for ages, so why didn't they just tell him? It's really weird, they wait for him to spend a whole load of time looking for her, and then at some point his friend's just like, I have to tell you something, Maya is Nimona. But there's no reason why they couldn't have told him that right away. They were just holding back this information for the audience. A lot of this movie is just Joshua hanging out with this robot kid called Alfie. They bond and it is quite cute, especially since at the end he makes a heroic sacrifice, and it's genuinely emotionally convicting to see the look of sadness on this kid's face as his father figure gives up his life for him. We also find out that his wife actually didn't die, but she is in a coma, and he needs to be the one to pull the plug because AI aren't able to kill the person who made them. So again, obviously that's very sad. Aside from that, the action is all reasonably entertaining. I mean, action usually should be exciting. There are two stupid moments that stood out. The first is some Special Forces operatives are pursuing Joshua because he's gone native, and early on, after they've just killed a whole base of people, they're arrested by the police, just like the local PD, which already seems a bit weird, but even though these guys are Special Forces, they're just put in a car with one single police officer, so obviously they escape. Also, despite the fact that America is a very anti-AI society, they still have AI border security, which obviously is incredibly stupid if they're fighting AI. At a pivotal moment, Joshua and Alfie are able to escape because Alfie interfaces with the border security robot and gets through. I'm not sure if I've reviewed this film so much as just presented a series of random disjointed observations about it, so just to be clear, this is my review. This film is fine. It has good moments and some vaguely interesting if incredibly generic themes. It also has some stupid moments and overall it's nothing special. For me it's got to be a middling 6 out of 10. Next up, and finally for this part, is Poor Things. Okay, right away, this film starts off with a little warning saying it contains depictions of pedagogics. I might just try and do this one, and include every single time I stumble over my words, just because I've been recording for 2 hours. So yeah, let's see how this goes, alright. Next up is Poor Things. Okay, right away, this film starts off with a little warning saying it contains depictions of tobacco products, which, okay, cool, but that's just so funny considering all the other things this film depicts, up to and including basically paedophilia. So if you weren't aware, this movie is about a woman who commits suicide, and then a crazy scientist discovers her and decides to take out her brain and replace it with the brain of her unborn baby. And the thesis statement of the film is pretty much that if a baby had the body of an adult woman, they would be obsessed with sex, which is certainly a contention. A lot of the movie is about sex, and also a lot of the movie is about gender. If the movie has a singular theme, it would be the possessiveness of men. A lot of men are attracted to this child Bella because of her innocence, and they're incredibly offended when she pays no heed to their jealousy. The best example of this is Mark Ruffalo's character, who is definitely the funniest part of the movie. I just love how angry he gets about the fact that a baby won't make a meaningful monogamous commitment to him. The other societal commentary would be regarding how women are raised. A recurring theme in this film is that Bella is totally mystified by the expectations of polite society, as she hasn't been raised to conform to them, and as such is arguably more liberated. But if this film has a singular point to its credit, it would be its artful dreamlike nature. This film really is like no other film I've ever seen. I'd liken it to Wes Anderson in terms of how cartoonish it makes real life appear, but it's even more bizarre than that. The world is also kind of steampunky, which is not as original of an aesthetic, but obviously functions to set the film in no real historical period. This is definitely visually interesting to look at, and the way the film is shot works to show off a lot of its best qualities and add to the strange overall feel too. Lots of fisheye lens. The soundtrack is also very unique and complements the emotional ambiguity of the film, like how the film is really very dark but never dwells on that darkness. The ending in particular is an example of this. The bad guy is defeated, but definitely in a way that's very creepy. And at other times, characters just don't have a very strong emotional reaction to things at all. Like how Willem Dafoe keeps revealing details about how his father conducted horrible experiments on him while he was a child, but never indicates any recognition that this was a very evil thing for a man to do to his son. It's definitely a good film, although it doesn't leave any lasting impression with me, mostly because aside from general artsiness and weirdness, the film doesn't commit to anything that compelling. It's dark, but not that dark. It's funny, but not that funny. So with that said, I can only really say that this film was very nice to look at, but that's where the bulk of my praise ends. Still, since visuals are very important, I'll give this a creditable rating of a high 7 out of 10. Well everyone, I hope you're excited for part 2. It will probably be the video recommended on your screen right now, so click that, and until next time, thanks for watching.